Good evening and welcome to my channel, The Moonlit Amble. I'm delighted to be stepping into the world of film criticism here on YouTube. As pretentious as that might sound, but what better way to begin than by tackling one of 2025's most enduring questions. Who will inherit the tux? In other words, who should be the next James Bond? And today we'll walk through the qualities I personally believe a modern Bond should possess, and look through some of the names that's most often whispered in casting circles and fan casts, etc. And then I'll give you my own choice. And consider this the beginning of our nice cinematic dialogue together, and yeah, nice to meet you. First, let's set expectations. Daniel Craig definitely redefined what Bond was. He gave us a more realistic, weary, bruised, dramatic figure. Bond became a man who was emotionally scarred and physically scarred. There was a lot of physicality in his performance, and while I definitely admired Daniel Craig's interpretation of the character, I'm ready for a shift. The Bond I personally envision retains Craig's intensity and gravitas, but hopefully pairs it with a little more wit and sparkle, similarly to, let's say, Pierce Brosnan or Sean Connery. I'm down for him to have a little bit more playfulness in the dialogue. I feel like the most recent Bond movies were always just drab. The charisma was certainly there, but none of the wit. And yes, please add more gadgets. Because for me, Bond isn't just a blunt instrument. He's a man of ingenuity, improv, and flair. There's a fun nature to the character. I want a Bond that can disarm a room by raising an eyebrow just as easily as he disarms a villain with an Omega watch with a laser.
You know, former SAS types with easy smiles and expensive watches. Rolex?
Amiga.
Beautiful.
Now to the contenders most often mentioned. So first off, we've got Idris Elba, who's at this point been a fan favorite for over a decade. Now, Elba definitely has the presence, the charisma, and the command on screen that would certainly make Bond feel both timeless and refreshing. But the only issue is his age. The role is a long commitment, and considering the time period between Casino Royale being in 2006 and No Time to Die being in 2021, you have to wonder, does Idris Elba really have give or take 15 years with the character? And I gotta say, I don't really see it. He's pretty close in age with Daniel Craig, and it's too much. Up next, we've got Henry Cavill, who's also a perennial candidate. He embodies a lot of the physical ideals of Bond, just being absolutely jacked. The man played Superman. He also came in second for Casino Royale, right behind Daniel Craig, so there is a precedent of him being picked for the role. And the man from U.N.C.L.E. is already basically a screen run, proving he could play like a charming spy. And he does roles with a good amount of gusto. So I do feel if he does get picked, he'd do a good job. That being said, at 41 years old, you do run into a similar age problem where, assuming the first movie comes out when he's 41, the last movie is going to be around 55, 56. Does he want to really be in a project like that? I'm not exactly sure, simply because of the fact that he's working on Warhammer 40k. He did movies recently like Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and it seems like he's really in his creative arc right now, and I can see him kind of double taking at the prospect of playing a character over the course of the next 15 years. Next, we've got Jacob Elordi. The internet seems to have really fallen for this guy, and I get it. He's been in projects like Euphoria and Saltburn. I watched Saltburn. I can definitely see his acting range. I couldn't really get into Euphoria. And he does have this menacing presence, and he certainly has the acting range. That being said, he's still in his 20s, and his youth might be a little bit of a stumbling block for the genre. I feel as though James comes in as a middle-aged veteran who's had a life before the whole spy shenanigans, and so if you get a guy who's too young, you might lose that sense of gravitas and the sense of a man who's seen and done things. And I do think Elordi has promise, but he may feel more like an apprentice version of Bond than a seasoned 00. Transitioning back into a man in his early 40s, similar to Cavill, we've got Theo James, who I've seen him recently in White Lotus, and he's a great actor. I saw him in The Gentleman, where he plays the suave Englishman amazingly, and I know he's no stranger to action in the OG tween novel series Divergent, so he's definitely got all of the tools and the materials there. What Theo has going for him that a lot of these guys don't is that he's not an A-list actor, which sounds like a negative, but most of the Bonds leading up to the Bond films were either kind of known or not known at all, so he definitely has the same steps as the ex-Bond actors, which really works in his favor. I don't really have any big criticisms for him, I just think there's a better choice, which will come later. But yeah, Theo James is a great choice. And speaking of great choices, we go right into Tom Hardy. Now, Tom Hardy is probably the best actor on this list.
Chairman of the board recommends that those of us who are blessed with the gift of sight, that we spend, at least half an hour of our day with our eyes closed, so that we may better understand the darkness.
Which I totally get includes Idris Elba, so take this with a grain of salt, but subjectively, I think he's the best actor, and I love the physicality he brings to his roles. We talk about Bronson, Mad Max, him as Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. There's nobody better at utilizing his physical presence than Tom Hardy, which would lend for an amazing Bond. And overall, from just an acting pedigree standpoint, he's just a powerhouse performer. But that's just the thing, right? He's an A-lister at this point, and like I said with Theo James, they don't really hire A-listers to play James Bond. It's usually the role that gets the guys into the A-list category, simply because of the fact that A, it's expensive, and B, once you become an A-list actor, you have this tendency to not want to pigeonhole yourself into one genre, right? And if you play Bond, you're probably going to play him for 3, 4, 5 movies. And a lot of guys don't want that commitment. At this point in his career, Tom Hardy is also leaning into his brooding eccentricity. He's got the mannerisms, the growls, that unpredictable energy, which would be really great with Bond. With that being said, it's not what I think Tom Hardy would want to do, especially playing the style of Bond, which I would like, which is the elegance, the control, and the wit. It's a little too playful and quirky, and I think he likes being the more brooding guy at this point. I'm thinking of the TV show Mobland recently. Fantastic TV show. If you guys haven't watched it, check it out. But it actually includes an ex-Bond actor, Pierce Brosnan, and Tom Hardy's wonderful in that, but he plays a cool, suave gangster with a bit of that rugged edge, but I don't think he's too interested on playing that witty character that we really need from the new age Bond. So while fantastic actor, I would love him as Bond, I don't think he's interested, and I also don't think he would want to play the type of Bond that I would want at this point in his career. Moving on to the last of our usual suspects, we have Nicholas Hoult, who I recently saw as Lex Luthor in the movie Superman, and while it is a good performance. I think my concerns with him as Bond was shown even more so as Lex Luthor, because he is not a very intimidating guy. I think he, again, has the range. He was definitely chilling in the menu, and he has the humor. I saw him in The Great TV show. Very funny, dark humor, dark comedy, and he was great in it. So while I think he could pull off the wit and the playfulness that I mentioned before, I still asked for a little bit of that grit, and he doesn't really exude dangerous. He's not very intimidating to me, and so I feel as though a lot of the other Bonds have a pseudo screen test where I can point to and I say, wow, that could be an iteration of Bond. So he doesn't really have that. Yeah, I think you run the risk of having him as a Bond because you don't really have a screen test of what he can do as a Bond adjacent character. Like him as a guy, like him as an actor, I think he has the range to do other amazing things. I'm not too sure about him playing James Bond. So who is my pick? Now, he was in the intro, and no, it's not Timothée Chalamet, it's Aaron Taylor Johnson. And for me, he's that rare candidate for the character who could definitely satisfy the two camps of the Bond fandom right now. I see a lot of people who want that raw intensity of Daniel Craig and Timothy Dalton, which I totally get and appreciate. And then there's the other camp, like me, who long for a return to form with the wittier, gadgety Bond. And I think he can play both really well and meld the two. He's also young enough to lead the franchise into the next era, but seasoned enough to bring the gravitas and charm needed. So he's basically the best of both worlds when you look at someone like Henry Cavill and Jacob Elordi. In many ways, he feels like the logical bridge between where Bond was and where he will be next. The other component is that Elba, Cavill, and Hardy all have a few roles that define them as actors, which is awesome and it's great, and it really speaks to their artistry within the acting world. But as I said before, the past Bonds have a precedent of having Bond as that role. Obviously, Sean Connery has had an illustrious career post the Bond series as well, so I'm not saying that you're going to be pigeonholed. It just seems to be that Bond is usually their first breakout gig. And for Aaron Taylor Johnson, he's been in a lot of great projects. Not so great as well with Kraven the Hunter. I pray for my $18 back for that one. But, he's been in Nosferatu, he's been in Bullet Train, and while he's been a standout and a great actor in both, they're not iconic enough for me to say that he's an A-lister right now. And I feel as though Bond would really launch him into that stratosphere, and it would make sense. I mentioned Bullet Train before, and I do really feel like that is the screen test to see how good he is as Bond, and he's fantastic. Similarly to Daniel Craig in Layer Cake, directed by Matthew Vaughn, it shows the potential for the Bondness, and I feel as though Aaron Taylor Johnson really has that. The wit in Bullet Train, the physicality, even the emotional portions. I think Bond isn't really an emotional character, although that took a huge turn in the more modern Bonds. So if they want to keep that emotional trajectory into the new Bond era, I think Aaron Taylor Johnson's capable of doing all of that. So in totality, he's got the chops, he's got the resume, and he's got the build-up, and he's got a similar history as a lot of the past Bonds, and I just think he'd do a fantastic job. I have a lot of hope for this new Bond series having Denis Villeneuve I think is how you pronounce his name, direct the new Bond will be interesting, and I have different thoughts on that, perhaps a separate video, but he's a fantastic director, and I'm sure whoever they cast will be great in the role. And while I do think it's going to be Aaron Taylor Johnson and he's best suited for the role, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Put it down in the comments. I'd love to just see the other options out there. This is sort of my brief perusal on Reddit and the online zeitgeist to see where the winds were blowing. And for me, while it is Aaron Taylor Johnson, I am so open to other smaller actors that you guys might feel would fit the role great. So thanks for sticking around, thanks for watching the video, and see you next time.